Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you all very much for coming. It's great to see such a good audience. And I need to stand still. So this is both a Yours seminar, the York Heritage Research Seminars, but it's also on the Being Human AHRC Festival programme as well. So maybe some of you have come under the Yours banner, and some of you will have found this because of the Being Human connection. Either way, you're very welcome to the King's Manor and to this evening's lecture, which is the latest in a series of lectures that are running through the autumn term. We've got one more next week, and then again into the spring term from January on heritage themes that link closely, usually, to the talk modules that are being presented in the department to our postgraduate students. So there is a connection for the students, but also they're of general interest to a wider audience. That's the idea. And tonight it's a great pleasure to introduce Graham Fairclough, who I worked with very closely over a number of years at English Heritage. Like me, Graham doesn't work for English Heritage anymore, left I think a little bit after me, 2 years after me or something like that, I think. 2.5 years after me, or 2.5 years. And he's now affiliated with the University of Newcastle University, not the University of Newcastle, which is another institution somewhere in the world. But Graham now works with Newcastle University, but he's retained his interest in landscape and in place, and is involved in a number of projects, some European projects that focus on that subject. So tonight Graham is going to talk about place and the past, landscape, heritage, synergies. Graham.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Good. Good evening. Am I audible at the back? Yeah, good. You never know. Right, place in the past, landscape heritage synergies. It was going to be called Where Do You Come From? But I thought a slightly more serious title might be needed, but it's really called Where Do You Come From? And I'm going to start with where do I come from? When John's partly covered it, I was going to explain how I've spent most of my career, not in formal academic institutions, but in the world of heritage management in English heritage, in different parts of the country, although hardly ever in Yorkshire, but then I am active from Lancashire, so that makes some sort of sense. But working in England can't be split from knowing what was going on to some extent in the rest of Britain and both parts of Ireland, even that was sometimes in a post or possibly a post-colonial sense. I'm not sure about this term post-colonial. I think it's like being a recovering alcoholic. You never actually are one, you're just a recovering post-colonialist. And for the past 20 years or so, I've spent a lot of time travelling. It says here I've spent a lot of time working, but it's more true to say a lot of time travelling through Europe, the rest of Europe, for things like the European Landscape Convention and its meetings, for the Fairclough Convention, which I'll talk a bit about, a number of European landscape networks, and work with the European Sound Foundation on a science policy briefing for landscape. So I've seen a lot of what goes on in other countries as well, though I don't pretend to understand those things very much. But nevertheless, that's the context I'm coming from, which underpins what I'm going to say this evening. And it involves both theory and practice, to some extent research, to some extent policy formulation, and nearly always, in one way or the other, though not necessarily very directly, been involved with people or what we think people think and what we think people want. And we constantly say, well, the public want this and so on in the heritage world. So we know all about human beings, people who make the heritage and use it. And it is a cliche, but like all cliches, there's a lot of truth in it. Heritage is about people, and I'm going to also argue that landscape is about people as well. Because ultimately, after doing all this heritage work, I began to find the idea of landscape more attractive in a sense, or at least as attractive as the idea of heritage, for all sorts of reasons. First of all, it's sometimes prettier as this, which is, I'm not sure if it is the earliest landscape painting in the world. It's one of the earliest landscape paintings or depictions of landscape in Siena, from the late 1330s. There's two of them. They're enormous murals in the Siena public hall, and it's the allegory of good and bad government. This is good government, where a healthy, prosperous landscape arises from the king and the prince and the nobles and the merchants doing good things in their city, and everything trickles down, that famous phrase from a few years ago. Prosperity trickles down into the countryside, where you have happy peasants toiling, growing crops, living in nice houses. But it's also interesting as a town-country dichotomy as well, and reminds us that the rural landscape only exists because of urban and vice versa, that they are a single thing. And we might come back to this picture a few times. But I came to landscape through various forms of heritage management from very sort of early on, from very straightforward and very comfortingly narrow approaches to designation and protection, where everything was clear. We knew exactly why we were doing it. It was to protect the resource so archaeology could do more with it in the future. Very comfortable in those days. Through many more broadly based conservation processes, getting into spatial planning, into wider forms of monument planning. In the 1990s, I got involved in more strategic designation reviews, which again began to broaden horizons towards the idea of landscape, towards the idea that a single site is just a tiny fragment of something much, much bigger, where there are other sites of its type or sites around it or its context or its setting or its place. And it could well be that I still think of myself as an archaeologist, but whether I am an archaeologist in the eyes of other archaeologists, I sometimes wonder, and whether I'm an archaeologist in the eye of the general public, who probably think that archaeologists excavate, and if you don't excavate, you don't do anything else. And my knees long ago gave up the possibility of serious excavation, so I'm not that sort of archaeologist. But I think I am an archaeologist. And at the same time, landscape has made me into a trespasser onto other people's lands. So I spend a lot of time now meeting with people who aren't archaeologists or aren't even heritage people, and pretending to be a sociologist or a geographer, or working with those people, or with landscape architects. So my inner feeling of whether I am still an archaeologist is sort of reflected by an outer awareness that the world I live in is mainly not archaeological anymore. But somewhere inside me, there's still an archaeological view of the world, which I think influences what I'm saying and thinking. And I find it particularly useful to meet these other disciplines, because those fences shouldn't be there. The divisions between different disciplines in heritage, and even more so in landscape, are completely artificial. Landscape is holistic in lots of different ways, and one of them is in the ability to understand it. And that you needed to have a bit of geography, a bit of architecture, a bit of history, a bit of archaeology, a bit of sociology, a bit of psychology, and all the other ologies to deal with the landscape. And I think increasingly that's true of heritage too. But also you need to climb the even bigger wall between humanities and science, and that's a division also which is very old, but not necessarily justifiable anymore. And it was very interesting. I mentioned before I worked with the European Science Foundation on the COST project program on helping write a science policy briefing called Landscape in a Changing World. That came about because the European Science Foundation, the ESF, wanted to run they have a whole series of policy briefings. They're usually about space travel or the science of geriatrics and aging or medical care or nanotechnology. And they wanted one first which was based in the humanities, but also one that was interdisciplinary and could reach out to a series of disciplines and also reach out back towards the sciences from the humanities. And they chose landscape as the subject for that, as a sort of experimental thing. They thought landscape was one of the best topics they could think of to push forward that interdisciplinary agenda. So that's where I come from. So the other question is, where do you come from? Where are you from? Who are you? This, by the way, which you saw on the opening screen, something I just came across by chance a few years ago in Spain. I don't know anything about it. I don't know what lies behind the wall, who painted it, why they painted it. It's a purely archaeological artifact in the sense that it speaks for itself or it doesn't speak at all. And you can see what I want to try and describe it. And I've got various theories of what was in the mind of the artist, and none of them are particularly nice. But again, we might come back to that. This question, where are you from, who are you, sounds like the sort of thing you might be asked at a checkpoint by faceless soldiers in helmets, and probably you are these days in many parts of the world asked that question. But here it means something slightly different. I think the way it's used in normal life, it's equivalent to asking, who are you? It's a question that you ask of strangers. You say, where are you from? And you may just mean, where have you come from today? How was your journey? But you probably mean more than that. It may not be geographical, could be, but it's a multi-layered question. It's trying to find out who the person is. You may well answer and say where you come from, and then you begin to have a dialogue. And in the question, where are you from, the idea of place is obviously there. What place are you from? But there's also the question of the past, because you're coming from somewhere in the past. It means what's your background? And it's a little bit like that question you get in sort of Jane Austen novels. Who are your family? I would not understand who you are. I don't know how to speak to you until I know who your family is, what your history is. And I think heritage and landscape are somewhere deeply embedded in the answers to those questions. And for that reason, there are other reasons, but for that reason alone, I would say that the way of doing heritage that we've inherited is probably inadequate, because it doesn't cover those soft issues about heritage, We're very good at looking at the fabric of things, the stone, the masonry, the bricks, the timber, the paintings, but not necessarily about what they mean to people in terms of people's background, their origins, their sense of belonging, where their parents came from, and so on. But that question is how we locate people, and it's a social location, it's a cultural location, it's a biographical, obviously, but it can be to do with economic or class context. You begin to know who somebody is from by answering that question. How poor are they? How well off are they? Which part of the world do they come from? Are they part of the favoured 5% like us, or are they the 95% who are not in favour? And as you ask those questions, get the answers, exchange answers, you begin to find shared territory. You sort of circle around each other. I'd not that long ago introduced a couple of fairly senior, by which I mean even older than me, landscape specialists from different disciplines, but they were both New Yorkers. And I don't think they knew each other, so I introduced them and said, you know, you both work with landscape and you're both from New York. And they both went, which part of New York? What school did you go to? And they asked a series of questions, and then they sort of both settled down and went, right. And they started talking about something sensible, because they could then place each other exactly in terms of where they came from. It was very funny. Whether two senior women would do the same, I don't know, but the men certainly did. And I think what this question does is underline the importance of being human, the importance to being human of place in the past. It's one of the things that makes us human, knowing where we are, knowing where we come from, therefore where we want to go. And it's probably true to say that there are very few ways to formulate identity that don't take account of the past and the present in one way or the other. And past and place, rather, one way or the other. And past and the place is just another way of saying heritage and landscape in some ways, which I might come on to later. And while heritage and landscape as words aren't that old, particularly a century or so in their present usage, older in different usages, and their meanings have changed constantly, but I always feel that the ideas behind those two words, whatever people call them in the past, have been there for as long as there have been human beings, probably, that people have always had landscape to some extent. Is the way of looking at the environment around you and making sense of it, make it into maps in your head, making it into knowledge of seasons, knowledge of animal movements, knowledge of where the next community is, knowledge of where your nearest market town is, and so on. All sorts of things to do with what we now call landscape in this wide sense, which I'll come on to. And I think you can see that longevity of the idea of landscape in all the national epics, like Canterbury Tales or the Mabinogion, all those, or even Don Quixote. They nearly all involve travel and traversing the country and defining the nation state by movement, by seeing it all. The mural in Spain, in Cordova, is another way in which people now are still using landscape as a metaphor. As I say, I'm not sure what the metaphor is. Funny little egg-shaped creatures running from rainbow-covered green fields into a hideous post-industrial landscape. Could mean all sorts of things. But the message is carried in the concept of landscape. They're not doing it some other way. They've used landscape to carry it. And the same goes for the images of landscape in Siena, where this is the other half of the picture. That's what happens when the prince is good and the world is in harmony. Everyone is doing what they're told and everything is trickling down. And this is where the prince is. You can't see it. It's a very damaged one with the bad government. And you can't really see what's going on in the town, but it's not what should be going on. There's various things like gambling and all sorts of things going on, and overeating and terrible things. And as a result, the countryside is blighted, and you've got burning fires and ruined houses, and there are no crops, and warriors coming over the hills to slaughter you, and big castles on the hilltops. So landscape here is being used as a way of passing on other messages, and I think you'll find it in many, many contexts. All these symbols rotate around the idea of landscape. And increasingly, I find it difficult to think about heritage and landscape at the same time without asking myself what is the difference between them, that they are getting really close together in their fundamental meanings and what they offer us. There are lots of different languages, of course. We have national languages and disciplinary languages, but the ideas behind are still very, very similar. Though you do have to bear in mind that the words for landscape in different languages are minefields. In Europe, most people now use the word landscape because of the European Landscape Convention, but they have their own words. So that the French, the Italians, the Spanish have words based on pay, land, and the Germans have words based on land. But the French word for land, pay, doesn't mean the same as land in English, but the German word sometimes does. You have to be careful what people are meaning by it. They have the extra meanings added to them. And who knows, exactly what the connotations of the Finnish word for landscape are, or what they'd say is the Finnish word for landscape, because again, there's evolution in that. And the word heritage changes too. But then when you leave national language and move into the realm of different academic disciplines, what we call heritage, or perhaps archaeology, and other disciplines called landscape, yet others will use the term biodiversity and mean similar things by it. They're talking about the interactions of all the components. They're talking about the whole, not the parts. They're trying to get at something which is above the individual site, get at something which is above the process, but which binds all those things together. Others talk about ecosystems the last few years. Sustainability is another of these overarching terms. It's not the same as landscape, and it's not rooted in the same way in physical material things, but it's trying to achieve the same aims. Even the word culture possibly is the same. Nature certainly is. The word environment is often mistaken for landscape. I would argue it's quite different, but nevertheless it carries some of the same messages. And then all the other words like place and townscape. And as this is a public lecture, I don't know how many people here are from what you might call the public, real people, ordinary people, as opposed to those of us who live in these strange contexts. But my feeling is that the majority of people who don't belong to a governance, government, planning context, professional context, or to an academic context, the majority of people in the country, in other words, and in other countries, don't use any of those words probably. They may use place, but they probably use other words like neighbourhood, or countryside, or the country, or home, maybe. Or perhaps they don't use a word at all. It's just so much a part of their everyday life, they don't need a word for it. It's just being, that the landscape is being. And we perhaps over-intellectualise it by having these different words for each discipline. But we need to have our own tools or we get bored. But I'm going to use landscape and heritage today because they're the words I tend to use, and I guess most of you do as well, for convenience. And I think there are other reasons which will become apparent. And just very briefly at the beginning to say that those two words include within them memory, individual memory, collective memory, shared memories. They both contribute to identity. So people identify themselves by their heritage, they identify themselves by where they live, or the landscapes of their birth, or the landscapes of their holidays perhaps, or even by the landscapes of their aspirations, where they want to be or what they want the landscape to be, being in a future aspect. Belonging, there's the old saying that in what some people like to call traditional landscapes, the landscape didn't belong to the farmer, the community belonged to the landscape. There's that sense of interaction of belonging, that you are your land and vice versa. Which I would argue we probably still have in urban contexts, though we don't use those terms to describe it, but there's still a sense of ownership of neighbourhoods. And both the word landscape and heritage, they encourage, I think, this may sound like a negative, I think it's a positive. They encourage complexity. They draw you in to look in more detail at what's going on. They encourage a pluralism of ways of looking at things and multiplicity. And probably they encourage an ambiguity and a set of contradictions as well, which again may be thought to be negative. But I think on the whole, those things are stimuli. They make you think further once you've got a contradiction, you investigate it. And they're things to be sought out rather than run away from. And finally, both of them, heritage and landscape, and this room is an example, they provide an arena for relationships, for people to come together, to share things, to discuss things, to work together. They both offer frameworks, which is, I think, probably their real value, their biggest value. And the relationships that they provide a framework for, or a place for, are relationships between people, between people and place, between people and materiality, the things around them, the realm of things, between people and non-humans, between people and animals and other forms of life. All of those things can be understood and discussed through landscape and heritage, but mainly I would say through landscape.
Because it's doing a restart. Sorry. Sorry, everyone.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the heritage and landscape are both powerful concepts, and they can do all sorts of things for us. They are, I think, also, they have been, rather, the last 10, 20, 30 years, in a state of flux and of change, and what we now call heritage isn't anything like what we called heritage when I started back in the 1970s, and the same goes for landscape. So first of all, heritage being in transition, being questioned on many fronts, challenged. We now see it as to do with creating and planning and looking forward rather than protecting and preserving to some extent. There are the exception to that. It's been challenged by all sorts of new approaches, localness, this sense of identity plays. Those are competitors as well as contributors to heritage. The environmentalism agenda isn't necessarily aligned with heritage. It may be challenging it as well, and so on and so on. They overlap with and have these difficult relationships with it. But the scope of heritage has broadened. You know, we've all seen it extending from the obvious things, castle, cathedrals, old houses, to other houses, industrial archaeology, 20th century, small things, and so on and so on. Petit patrimoine, as the French call it, the tiny local things. The rise of the local is an aspect of that. So heritage, what we call heritage, has got bigger and bigger. We've recognised that site-specific understanding, site-specific action is inadequate because you need to have things in context. And that recognition is quite old. It goes at least back to the 60s with conservation areas, but has been getting more and more prominent in all directions. We've accepted that there's a plurality of heritage values, that the evidential or the archaeological value of something isn't the only value, there's all the other values. But going further, I think most people now recognise that those values are not in the object, they're attributed to it, so they're intangible values. We put it into the object, so that heritage itself, even when it is material like this table, heritage itself is intangible because it's a matter of values. And the definition of, or the expectations perhaps of what the heritage process does is also getting wider and wider, and it's no longer deemed to be enough by politicians, by the general public to preserve things. It needs to do more. It needs to contribute towards growth, towards employment, towards well-being, and so on and so on. So the whole canvas is enlarging and has enlarged. It's become forward-looking, as it says there. And when I say that landscape and heritage are sort of moving closer together, so that we ought to think about using them together, I don't mean start talking about heritage landscapes, because that raises in my mind the question of which landscapes aren't heritage, since all landscapes have an heritage dimension. And I'm not talking about landscape heritage, which you could say is the bits of heritage which look like landscape, the field boundaries, the walls, the street pattern in the town, for example. I don't mean that when I say landscape and heritage. I mean something much bigger, that they are together, they are everything, and that things are both heritage and landscape, and that one contains the other. And a lot of this has been summed up, codified, if you like, in the Fairclough Convention, which is almost 10 years old now, I forget. The value of cultural heritage for society, which is in force in Europe and signed by, I didn't look it up, 15 or 18 countries perhaps. But they're mainly the countries at whom it was aimed in the first place. In other words, the ex-Soviet Union, independent states, and the survivors of the disintegration of Yugoslavia. Because the Fairclough Convention is very much about heritage as a form of conflict resolution and avoiding it being used as a form of warfare, the destruction of bridges, destruction of people's mosques. And its underlining point is that heritage is a human right. Everyone has a right to their heritage, but equally a responsibility to respect other people's heritage. So you don't go around blowing up people's churches or mosques during a civil war, for example. But also the Council of Europe, which is their convention. The Council of Europe is now arguing that heritage is a tool of reconciliation. You bring people together by sharing heritage or by sharing landscape. Because at the end of the day, two conflicting communities are occupying the same land, they're sharing the same landscape. If they've got anything in common, it's that. They may not have anything else in common, but they are occupying the same land, which leads to tensions, but can be also a way out. But the Fairclough Convention also speaks about heritage not being looked after for its own sake only, but because of the role it plays, seeing it as a resource, not an asset, not something to be locked away and kept safe for experts, but something which is constantly taken out and used. And my feeling of what really underlines Fairclough as well is that it's saying that heritage isn't a thing, it's not a product, not what you end up with after you've done your repairs and your restorations and your interpretation. It's actually a process. It doesn't have an end, it's just going on and on. And if you accept heritage as being a verb, that you're doing something all the time, and you begin to think that people have got their own heritage around them all the time, then you wonder where heritage happens. Does it happen in the expert sphere? Or is most heritage taking place unseen every single day when someone leaves their house and meets somebody or walks down the street? It becomes a really democratic thing on that basis. But Fairclough also talks about other things as well, like dynamic heritage and so on. And again, it takes this idea that heritage is pretty well total, that nearly everything is heritage. I'll come back to it later, I think. Landscapes evolved as well, from being, in a very simplistic way, being originally to do with, at least in the 16th, 17th century, 15th century, being a matter of pictorial aesthetic matter, what we in this country call scenery, but the rest of Europe tends not to. But nevertheless, that aspect of landscape as being scenery, the pictorial view, or the representational view of other things, the way it reflects social structures, for example, as in those two. It's moved on to being lots of other things, so that it's the embodiment of people in the land. It's how people work with the land, is broadly shown to some extent in the lower picture. It's to do with community, and I'll come back to that later on, that landscape is actually another, it's almost a synonym for community, because people are working together on the landscape. And it's more than environment, because it's got the cultural dimension, time, depth, and so on. And all this has changed. But I think possibly, of all the things that have changed in landscape, I've not mentioned all of them, but in conceptualizing landscape, of all the things that have changed, none of them really touches to the heart of it quite as much as the distinction. So I've lost my. Yeah, the distinction, if you like, or the shift from an objective view of landscape as something that you look at and do things to a subjective view, something that you are part of and work with. It's an objective-subjective shift, which I think is the biggest change in landscape. So that landscape ceases to be an object or a thing, or even a set of things, or even it's not even a set of relationships. It's a way of seeing, a way of thinking, a way of acting, a way of being, if you like, with the world. It's a way of understanding the world around you and sharing that with other people and having a way to go forwards. And it's that aspect of landscape, that conceptual one, that allows it to be a really powerful integrating and unifying tool, because it doesn't set up boundaries. It's opening itself up to all disciplines, all types of people. And I increasingly believe that those two trajectories of change of heritage and landscape in the last 20, 30 years have not been parallel, but they're convergent. They're moving together. So whilst heritage has moved from a long time ago now, but from a focus on sites and monuments down towards a concept of heritage as process and to do with place, the togetherness of everything, landscape has similarly moved from a fairly narrow scenic and visual definition 50 years ago, perhaps longer, down to a view again that it's to do with perception and community. And those two sets of words at the bottom are almost the same as each other. Process and place on the left for heritage, perception and community for landscape. You can switch them down, they both apply. And I think we've got to that stage by a series of lendings and borrowings that both the disciplines have been, and the concepts have been speaking to each other. So heritage, you might argue, has taught landscape that it has time depth, that it's not simply a natural thing out there now, but it's got a long history, and that history is man-made through human agency. The second thing I've chosen to put there, I say chosen because you could have lots of things. I think landscape has also taken from heritage the idea of constant change, the continuity of change, that landscape hasn't always been the same, so that not many of us would speak about traditional landscapes, but a lot of people from other landscape specialists talk about the traditional landscape, which is usually the one about 60 years ago, with the assumption that before that it was forever unchanging, and we know that wasn't the case. So we can add that extra dimension to landscape, and I think that those and various other transmissions have changed the concept of landscape, and in the opposite direction. I mean, heritage has taken quite useful from landscape the idea of character, this idea that you take lots of different aspects and merge them into a generalized view and come up with a view of the whole, not of the parts. We've learned more about relationships from landscape than we might otherwise have done. We've got different contexts, but most important, different scales from landscape. Because landscape isn't a scale, landscape is any scale at all. Landscape is scalable, it goes up and goes down again, and heritage can adapt that and do the same. So I think we've got a convergence of the two concepts, which is useful, and we ought to use. And then finally, they both picked up on this thing about values not being intrinsic. They both accept that is the case. Landscape in the European Landscape Convention speaks of landscape being an area perceived by people, whose character is the result of natural human interactions, but perceived by people is the key element of the landscape definition for the convention. And as we said before, as we all probably agree, the values that are in heritage are the ones that we put there, not the ones that are there to begin with. We don't dig them out, we put them in. And there's all sorts of reasons for this convergence, apart from what I've mentioned. It's been pushed forward by the European documents, like the Landscape Convention, the Fairclough Convention, the Science Policy Briefing. But changes at more practical level in how what in this country we call countryside management work. That's also brought the two things together, so that on the one hand, you've got the idea of multifunctionality, that agricultural landscapes have to do a whole series of different functions to keep them in the state we want them to be in. And in heritage, we've shifted from a preservation ethic to some extent towards a managing change. Those two things are quite similar in the way they actually work on the ground. And both sides of that equation, landscape and heritage, have seen a shift away from the assumed dominance of expert opinion towards attempts at greater democracy. I say attempts, but I think it's a sort of, it's a grail. It's something you never quite reach, but attempts at more inclusivity. In fact, experts starting to try to be facilitators rather than figures of authority. And bringing the two together really does suggest that everything is heritage, because the landscape is everywhere. There's nowhere which is not landscape. Certainly not in this country, I would argue in the world, even the most remote places, is perceived by somebody at some point, even if it's in the head or it's in films or in photographs. And certainly in this country, everything is landscape, and therefore so is heritage. We bring the two together, and even if you don't. But if you suggest that everything is heritage, somebody always says, but you can't protect everything. Now, and I find this difficult to explain, because why do they assume that the word heritage means protection? We do. We've had that equation in our mind for a long time now. If something is heritage, it must be protected. Why? Why not step back and say, if everything is heritage, which bits do we want to protect and what do we do with the rest? And the equation of heritage protection actually rules out from any consideration by us at least 95%, 99% of the landscape, because you've already said it's not heritage. It's like those little diagrams you used to get in terms of project management, where one axis is money, and one is, well, in this case, numbers, the numbers of heritage sites, say, and the other one is what you want to do with them. If the money is fixed and you want to change the shape of the triangle, one of those two sides has to change. The side with numbers is going up all the time, getting bigger and bigger. The money is fixed. So what you do, the bottom line can't stretch because you can't protect everything, as it rightly says. You need to change the objective, so it's not preservation, but lots of other things. And I thought this argument had been sort of more or less worked through until last week at the ICOMOS meeting, where I realised that a lot of people don't get this. They still say, well, you can't protect everything, we can't make hedges too big. So I tried to make a diagram. It's not a very good diagram, and I apologise for the resemblance to the Russian flag. It wasn't intentional. It was only when I saw the colours afterwards. And it goes on the next screen. It goes to the next screen and gets replaced by a nicer flag, so don't worry. But time left to right, heritage is getting bigger, going on the left-hand margin, up and up and up. The red bit is, for sake of argument, listed buildings, and we get more and more of them, but we've still only got less than 500,000, where the number of buildings is whatever it is, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, and that's just a fragment of heritage, and we keep finding more heritage, so the top line is going up, so there's an ever-growing gap between what is heritage out there and what we found of it, and an ever-growing gap between what we found and what we want to protect, the red areas. And you can't preserve everything, they say. Well, of course not. But there are other ways of dealing with heritage rather than preservation. Many other ways of dealing with heritage, and they're still heritage while you're doing it. And this is where the Russian flag disappears. And luckily, it's a nice rainbow flag, which wasn't intentional, but it worked quite well. You know, and we all know these words. We've been using them for decades. We have adaptation. You take heritage and you adapt it to some other use, and in the process change it. So it's not preserving, it's changing. We have recycling of things, which might be recycling of objects, but can be recycling of buildings, of complexes, of land, of landscape. Conversions, consumption, we just use the heritage till it's gone, or some aspects of it. That's what heritage is for. I always like to remind myself that the word conservation, or conserve, and the word preserve, or preservation, at one level mean making jam, or pickling fruits. And you don't do that to keep them forever in the cupboard, you do that so you can eat them next year. And we've taken that word and we've sort of made it into a permanence, and it's not necessarily. So we can consume heritage, we can remember heritage even when it's gone. And it can be argued that some heritage, when destroyed, becomes stronger as heritage, but it becomes stronger in memory. How many of us would remember the Buddhas that were blown up a few years ago? If they hadn't been blown up, they'd be out there somewhere, but we wouldn't be speaking about them constantly as a reminder of things, as a sign of things. So remembrance is another way of dealing with it. And you can mark things that have gone in various ways, so they have a physical as well as an intangible memory. Things can be dismembered and spread out, and bits of things can go elsewhere, which is what we've always done. That's why the British Museum has got parts of the Acropolis. And they can be destroyed. And the act of destruction is a form of heritage decision. You're deciding that we don't want to pass it on for some reason, but it's still engaging with the heritage rather than simply ignoring it and saying it's not part of the sample. Reconstructed, which we always do as well, etc. Everything else, and all the things I've forgotten or I didn't think of. I'm sure there's a million of them. You probably go all the way around 3 times. And if you change the objective from being just protection to being any of these things, or sometimes all of them, or sometimes several of them, then the problem disappears. You can say everything is heritage because you're not trying to preserve it all. And you end up discussing it in a way that helps people use it for their identity, for their sense of belonging, for their being in the world, all the things we discussed at the beginning, or I discussed at the beginning. I'm out of time. No idea where I am now. Oh, I better rush them. This is a slightly different idea, but this is about theft, or at least appropriation. I was talking before about landscape changing its meaning. If you go back before the Renaissance, perhaps, or that sort of period, you have a different sort of landscape entirely, which isn't to do with visuals and scenic. It's what Ken Olvig, in that reasonably famous article for the making out of the hand of the Associated Bacon Geographers back in the 90s, recovering the substantive nature of landscape. He wrote it partly as in opposition to Cosgrove and Daniels trying to promote the idea of landscape being representation and symbolism. He wanted to bring back the materiality of it. But in the process, he also brought back the notion from the Middle Ages. Some people call it a Nordic notion, but I think it's more widespread than Scandinavia. The notion that landscape is community, and that the scape isn't to do with the view. Scape is the same as shape or ship. It's something which contains, in this case, it contains people. So in the English analogy, the township, the thing that we had before parishes, the township was the area of land that contained a community of people. It was their landscape, if you like. They shared it, they farmed it collectively. And on this view of landscape becomes a collectivity, the way that people work together. And it therefore becomes even more important politically, I would have thought. But that meaning tends to disappear under the weight of these scenic views in the 17th, 18th, well, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and landscape is sort of taken away from that general meaning, and you end up having to be either educated with the right sort of aesthetic training to appreciate it, or you have to go to one of the great houses and look at its parkland, or you have to go to a site of elite tourism, as in waterfalls and so on, to see it. Landscape gets put into cages, and they still exist in a sense. We call them national parks now, but it's still there in a sense, the idea that you go to the national park to see landscape because you haven't got any at home. But in fact, we all got landscape at home, and we always used to have. And I think that something similar happened with heritage. Because again, heritage, looking at literally, means what we've inherited. Oops. What we've inherited. And I think over the last century, or maybe longer, we've lost that wider perspective because we've hidden it under what I've just been talking about, this desire to protect it. Because we could only protect some, we've pulled ourselves back and said, heritage is just what we can pass on, only what we can protect. So we've lost that wider meaning in the same way as the wider meaning of landscape vanished. And it's probably now about to be reclaimed, or starting to be reclaimed in both fields. It's partly also because we've allowed a heritage as well to be defined by threat. We're pretty close to this position now where something is heritage only if it's threatened. We've always said that that's when people get excited and want to protect something, but it's more than just that. It's the concept of rescue, of risk, of save, of threat. Those are things that tell you if something is heritage or not. If it's not under threat, then it just goes away and becomes part of life again. And that's not a particularly healthy way to look at things. It's a very defensive way. Okay, I've been mentioning landscape and heritage, and I've mentioned the Landscape Convention and the Faroe Convention. Both those two conventions are quite subversive in their own way, as I've slightly hinted at perhaps. But my feeling is that if you put them together, they become incredibly subversive, or very radical, and they will overturn lots of ideas. And we were lucky enough to get some funding from something called the Joint Programming Initiative for Cultural Heritage, which is European. It's a collaboration of the research councils of, I think, about 28 countries now. But when we got this project, there were only about 12 countries involved. And we got funding for a project called Cherryscape, or Cherryscape, which stands for Cultural Heritage in Landscape, but the in could be as or of or and as well. Restart? Oh, yep, thanks. Just trying to go home early. And it is, as it says there, we've got 7 partners in 5 countries. This country Norway, Netherlands, Belgium and Spain. And it's a very simple project. We're simply going to organise 5 conferences. But the conferences are the research tools. They're listening conferences. We're not using them to present results or to disseminate information. We're bringing people together, speakers, audiences, having discussion sessions, and we're trying to find out what people think about the synergies, the relationships in landscape and heritage, in order to see how far this idea might go. And the aim really is to see how used together, or whether in fact they become the same thing, as either way, but how used together they become a tool for constructive use of heritage, and how they can improve landscape, but more than that, how they can go beyond landscape and heritage and into mainstream policies, how they can frame discussion on energy, for example, or food security, or how you cope with mobility and demographic change. I mean, people moving in large numbers across Europe, they're leaving one landscape, coming to another landscape, they're taking their landscape with them in their heads and superimposing it onto where they go. They're meeting people where they arrive with their landscapes. They've got landscape collisions. You've got heritages meeting. The concept of landscape and heritage together is a way of addressing those among all the other things I mentioned. So we're trying to feel our way into the value of this idea that heritage and landscape might come together. And we've got 5 conferences. We've had 2 of them so far. 3 more to go in Oslo, Madrid and Newcastle. So if any of you want a nice couple of days in a stimulating intellectual context discussing landscape and heritage, then come to Oslo. This one's about community, the next one. Each one is themed on a different aspect of the relationship between heritage and landscape. And then more or less practicalities. They're the happy pictures again. It's ironic that my photograph was out of focus for the cheerful part. It wasn't deliberate, but the gloom bit on the right is in crisp focus, and the sort of hopeful part isn't. That says something, I guess. Just a few examples. In a way, they start from very expert and go to less expert, but that wasn't the intention necessarily. This is partly because I was thinking that when you look at landscape and heritage together and think what landscape is and how it's linked, how it's centered on people and where people live now, we should stop saying landscape is urban as well. We should start saying landscape is usually urban. Maybe not in a geographical sense, but in the sense of where people live, what they have in their heads. And when they go to the countryside, they're often bringing with them urban concepts, or they're having urban lifestyles in the villages. But nevertheless, we ought to think that the urban landscape is the main thing. And we ought to also have this other hedges everything. And the next 2 examples are about that. This is about the everything one. That when we did historic landscape characterization in English heritage, one of the things we were trying to say was that everything is heritage. We didn't want any gaps. The whole of South Yorkshire, the whole of Northumberland, the whole of England is historic landscape of one sort or the other. And that was one of the aims. Some people didn't like the fact that it didn't attach value judgment. It didn't say one bit is more important than the other. And that's because we thought that we were simply trying to say, as far as we could, given the resources, this is what's there. You decide what to do with it, but just decide for everything. Don't decide for bits of it. That was the message we were trying to get, which was a landscape message as well as a heritage message. On the most landscape is urban, the example I've chosen was Lincoln Townscape Assessment. It's a few years old now, but it's still valid. And David Walsh and Adam Pottington did all the real work. We took the whole of the city of Lincoln. The historic core is, I think it was down a bit in the middle. But we divided it into neighbourhoods. We chose that word, but it could have been called almost anything. But it's this idea of what word to use again. Neighbourhoods seem to summarise townscape and landscape and heritage. And for each of those areas, they described the character. I'm going to say historic character, but some of them are only 1990s housing estates. So they described the character as if it was all the same age. They looked at trajectory of change through an individual area and between them. So there's a stream of arts and crafts architecture style which starts in the southwest in the 1920s and moves around the city through time, getting weaker and weaker, but always there. It's a sort of link and strand. There's lots of little examples like that. We didn't look at the centre very much, the cathedral, the castle, the Roman city, the medieval town, because we all know about it. That wasn't the aim. We wanted to point out that everything in this place was heritage and landscape. And it's on the web. You can find it from this web address. It's available. You see how old it is because the age of the smartphone. I don't know which one it is. It's probably an iPhone 2 or something. But when you're there, it tells you where you are and you get all this information. When you're not there, you can still get to it and so on. And there's endless layers and layers of information about townscape. But perhaps most importantly, and the 2 things there, one is a methodology of how it was done, but more importantly, plans in place is a product of a 2-year research action project where the person who made it stayed and worked in the planning department on a whole series of case studies and worked through with planners and developers and designers on how you could use the character assessment in new building work in Lincoln. Saying to developers, go away and look at the character plan for that area and come back with a proposal. And sometimes the planners said, come back with a bigger building. Your building's too small for that part of the town. They had bigger buildings in the 19th century, 18th century. It fixed the character, sometimes the opposite. And perhaps most importantly is that aspect of it. And that's just some examples of using the heritage landscape thing for practical applications in planning. Floods. Shouldn't be talking in York about floods. You all know about floods. But I'm not going to talk about the York floods. I just like to point out how useful bridges are for measuring water level. I'm going to come to bridges later. Bridges are very important things. Water in the wrong place at the wrong time. Southwest England earlier this year. I mean, you had your own floods, I know, but the one that got on the television, the Somerset levels, massive amount of flooding villages for months and months and months. But what was interesting about it was that once we got past the newspaper headlines, like things like green ideology had turned deluge into a flood, or headlines about climate change, or headlines laughing at politicians with brand new Wellington boots and so on. Once we got past all that, and I think it's the first time I've ever really noticed it, there was the beginnings, I wouldn't go stronger than that, the beginnings of serious discussion in the newspaper media, or some of them, and on television and on the radio, a serious discussion about environmental matters, about landscape, about why did it happen, what should we do? Was it really because they didn't dredge the rivers? Was it because the water levels were artificially high for nature conservation reasons? If so, why? What's the Somerset levels for? And it got into a really complicated set of issues about landscape, about heritage, about social aspirations, about nature and so on. And I don't think I've ever seen that before. It died away when something else happened in the world. It only lasted about 2 weeks. The floods went on, but the discussion didn't. But nevertheless, it began to raise the idea that landscape is something you can use to discuss real world problems like the Somerset levels floods. And I found that really interesting. In the Netherlands, they've always had this tradition of keeping the water out with big dikes and things, and they've given up. They've introduced something called let the water through, or make room for the water. So, and some Dutch people found it rather difficult because they're used to being told that you must control water, and now it's being allowed to rush through the Netherlands from the Alps all down the Rhine and out again. But they're still using hard engineering solutions. It's still about deepening river channels, widening floodplains. It's still not addressing the social aspects of how people live in relation to the floods and so on, and whether they're living in the right places, which is one of the problems here, of course. But landscape heritage, they are beginning to impinge on these really big issues. And these are some of the things that came out of the Somerset levels one. Dredge the rivers isn't actually necessarily the reason, but the one I really liked, and I suspect you did as well, the Middle Thames, it wasn't really till the water got down towards Windsor that the press really woke up, they began to notice it, and the MPs and the politicians really came out. And then people noticed the Jubilee River, which had been built to take floodwater past Windsor, Eton and a few other places. When it flooded, did its job perfectly well, but then dumped the water on areas to the east where slightly poorer people lived. I won't say poor people, but it's southeast England, but slightly poorer people. And so you began to get social issues, social equity issues thrown into the equation as well. And it also makes you wonder about how these things presented. So the bottom three pictures of the Jubilee River in its pre-construction vision, its representation of what it is now, and the reality of what it is now. So you've got all this various levels of rhetoric as well which surround it, which may or may not be accurate. And finally, bridges. They're a major aspect of heritage, but they're also a major aspect of landscape. They connect places. They're linked into long-distance mobility chains. They actually are part of the skeleton of landscape. But they're also potent symbols of unity and harmony, bringing people together, persistent. The symbols of progress and growth. Every time somebody opens the biggest bridge in the world, it's a great national achievement, whether it's Portugal or Sweden or somewhere in the Far East. Conversely, their destruction, like Mostar in Bosnia, is a sign of chaos and exclusion, and the need to rebuilding becomes pretty strong, and Mostar is rebuilt. Naming bridges becomes a way of bringing community together, sharing. There's a whole subculture in some parts of the Northern Balkans of artworks and culture taking place on bridges to bring together the broken communities of Bosnia, for example. So they're very important symbolically. They can even occasionally, excuse me, they can even occasionally destroy a World Heritage Site. The bridge at the bottom is the, I can't pronounce it, the Volksschlossen Bridge in Dresden. And because of that bridge, which was planned before it was designated World Heritage Site, but because of that bridge, the site was taken off the World Heritage Site, on the second one ever. So, but it's, by all accounts, becoming a tourist attraction. People are still going to Dresden, they're going to see the bridge. So, bridges are important, but I just want to show this other bridge, which is the opposite of the Dresden one in a way. Bordeaux, the lifting bridge, the Pont Lavant, Chaban-Delmas, opened this year. Sorry. I think UNESCO wasn't too keen on it to begin with as well, because Bordeaux is World Heritage too. They weren't too keen on a bridge this big within sight of the historic core of the town. But the difference is that Bordeaux has a mayor, Alain Juppé, who's extremely powerful. He was the French foreign minister recently, he was the French prime minister a few years ago. He's likely to become a parliamentary candidate for the right wing in 2 years' time. He's not somebody you tangle with easily. And at the same time, they were beginning to discuss the whole issue of, because of Dresden, the whole issue of historic urban landscape. How do you preserve World Heritage landscapes in major cities which still have economic growth, life, and which have to carry on moving to one extent or the other? So this bridge carries all this symbolism. The name, Chaban-Delmas, was a previous right-wing mayor of Bordeaux. The present mayor is using that name because he wants his name on the next one. And it's part of his campaign to become president, probably. Its function, it's got a really important social function, linking the historic core to one of these suburbs on the other side that was really isolated and was getting bigger and bigger, but wasn't part of the conurbation. It's designed to allow cruise ships, which is an economic necessity, but it's also a symbolic necessity because Bordeaux's existence is to do with going outwards. You go from Bordeaux, you go to the sea, you come to Britain, or you go across the Atlantic. In doing so, luckily, you bypass Paris. You don't have to go through Paris. So it's also celebrating Bordeaux's separation, which goes right back to the Roman period and the early Middle Ages. So the bridge is also, at one level, a symbol of Bordeaux being a city in its own right, not subservient to Paris, but also this idea that it's looking outwards. And they're constantly bringing in tall ships, like the one on the stamp. And the one at the bottom is a brand new replica of the boat that took Lafayette to America to tell the Americans that the French army were coming in the War of Independence. That's very important to the French, that story, and they've rebuilt the figures. It's back to go to the States. But the first thing it did was come to Bordeaux to go under the brand new bridge, and that's a real conflation of heritage, past and present, and future, and of landscape, all mixed together. And it's constantly, the day it opened, it was full. It's full when the Lafayette frigate went through. It's constantly full. And when it was opened, the most symbolic thing of all, the mayor of Bordeaux stood on the Bordeaux side. The bridge was up. The President of the Republic of France stood on the other side. The bridge came down, and they walked across, and the mayor met the president in the middle of the river. Now, how symbolic is that? And that's landscape and heritage providing a stage for all sorts of things. So that's it, really. Conclusions, or at least final words. Whilst landscape and heritage both started life separately, separate sectors, they both had the same sort of ideologies. They both began with top-down appreciation, top-down valuation, limited preservation of things, but they both follow this same move towards wider views. We don't know where it's going to go next, obviously, but they are moving in that sort of direction, like a sort of gentle wave. And I think probably of the two, I suspect heritage will gain more than landscape from that sort of union or that marriage. But I suspect that landscape will bring heritage into a wider interdisciplinary field, because landscape is inherently interdisciplinary right across the whole spectrum. You know, you have psychologists working with landscape, you have therapeutic landscapes, you have sociologists working with landscape, everything. I mean, heritage hasn't quite got the same breadth. It's very broad, but not so wide. So I think heritage might benefit more, but heritage does have a lot to teach landscape as well. And as I say, one of the things before was that that things always change, which heritage teaches. And probably also the thing that heritage lends to landscape is a constant reminder that we people, we don't stand at the edge of the natural world as an impact. We're actually in it, we're part of it. We're not an impact, we're impacted on, we are an impact too, but we're impacted on. We're at the centre of it as well. Landscape puts us there, heritage puts us there. So the two together are really useful. But very finally, I come back to people again, and not to nature or to environment, but to people. Because the reason why I think landscape is a more powerful concept than environment and heritage too, but landscape particularly, is because it's about people. People are at the centre of it. It's in people's heads. It's what people want the future to be like. And I think that's perhaps what that thing up there is telling us. The meal from Cordova. I think it's using landscape to say where the world is going and why we don't want it to go in that direction. That's using the landscape to make a political statement about the future, about aspirations. We don't all want to be little egg-shaped fluffy things in a field with a rainbow, but we certainly don't want to be in this constant just a hell on the right. And landscape is the message of that, I think. And the other picture there, which you've not seen before, just about the two, is the Alcava Dam in Portugal being built a few years ago. It's finished now, and the lake is one of the largest man-made lakes in Europe. It meanders up several valleys into Spain even. It's a massive thing. But when I went there in 2002, it was just being finished, and there were crowds of people coming to visit it. There were little impromptu car parks, there were food vans, there were burger stalls. It was turning into a tourist attraction. And I think back in the 60s in this country, people would have gone to look at the engineering works. We all believed in progress. Well, they all believed in progress then. But my feeling there wasn't that they were going to look at the engineering works. I think they were looking at the landscape. They were looking to see what was going to be lost, the olive groves, the land, and what was going to be gained. They were making sort of judgment. They were saying goodbye, if you like, but they were also staking a claim too. I think that series of photographs also tells us a lot about people, landscape heritage, placed in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you for so skillfully sort of addressing the objectives of the Yours series of seminars, but also obviously the Being Human festival as well. And you've managed to capture both of those agendas very neatly. So thank you for that. And we have plenty of time for questions. So it's an opportunity to raise points for discussion or ask specific questions. Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm not from the press.
Didn't think you were.
Mike, please do. Why did classical landscape go out of the picture, out of fashion, when it demonstrated ownership? And so it was the owners who opted to change to more naturalistic landscape.
In terms of landscape design?
18.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a political change, wasn't it?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in that field. I suspect it's to do with the relationship of people and nature. It's an attempt to say that we can control nature and make it look natural, even though it's not. I suspect, but I could be wrong. I mean, there are many people better qualified than me to talk about that.
Don.
Right, given that, I certainly agree with you that heritage is a verb, not a noun, it's a process. And it's a set of engagements we have with the past, both physical and mental. And given that landscape, we link to heritage, landscape is something that's ever changing, always has and always will be ever changing. Do you think there's really any point to heritage conservation as current practice?
Yes.
Right. What is it?
Because we're riding. If you see change and continual change as a sort of as a wave, if you like, as motion, or as an animal even, then we're riding it. We're going with it. We're steering it. We can't reverse it or stop it. But you can go with it. It'll take you places. There's lots of points. It just may not be the point we thought it was in the past. We may be looking for slightly different end objectives.
So do you think we're riding the wrong horse, saying as archaeologists that we must preserve or conserve or schedule all this places and things?
I think my worry is that we only say that. Too often we only say that, and we don't place that as in a spectrum of 20 or 30 things. We sometimes only say it. We often say it's the main thing, and all the things get pushed out. We leave them to somebody else, and there's no one else to do them, so they don't get done. I don't think it's quite as black and white as not doing those things, but it's stopping us doing all the other more interesting things.
Yeah, certainly has more interesting. Yeah.
Kat.
Hi, I was pleased to see you cite Kenneth Orwig, whose work I find quite interesting. I remember reading one of his essays about the past and the present being binaries, but something that we shouldn't be doing is dividing them.
Past and present.
Yeah, and I wondered if that was something that you think is, or what your thoughts are on that, in case, you know, we have this idea that heritage is always in the past, but perhaps it's not. Perhaps it's.
I think I'm starting. Maybe to do with getting old. I think I'm starting to think that the present doesn't exist, and the dichotomy between past and future, and the present is that very brief. It's gone. It's already past. It's squashed. We still live in it, but very briefly. And then the new present comes along. So the real question, I think, is how do we make the link from past to future? And obviously you go to the present, but it's like a river. It's like the old Chinese saying, the river never flows past twice because it's different water. Well, the present's always with it, but it's never the same present. Whereas the past and the future maybe are the past. So I'd see it slightly differently. I usually agree with Ken because it's safest.
Yes.
Cleverer than I am.
In the opening part of the presentation, you used many and varied words to describe and define our landscape and heritage. And I was just getting the impression that because everybody's represented, everybody has their say, and because we must recognise all these different groupings of social, cultural, political, memory, the feeling, the place, etc., when you load up all these different elements of what people understand by their perception, you actually dilute what landscape heritage actually means, and people actually lose their representation in that process because it's spread so thinly across so many groups which have to be represented. Then you actually lose the potency of individual opinion.
Unless each of those people or each of those sections is going into depth in theirs and bringing them together at the end as a wider picture, then you end up with a really rich tapestry, if you like, or series of tapestries.
Competing elements in.
Sorry?
A competing element within different groups.
Well, they can complement rather than compete. I tried to say that I think complexity and contradiction is not necessarily bad things because they take you further. Like tensions can be good, constructive tensions. So I don't see it as a particular problem if you've got two sets of people working on the same landscape from different perspectives, come to different conclusions. Because landscape is plural, you simply take them both and move on to something else. They may join again in the future, they might not.
Yeah, I think that's quite a mind journey, let's say, to be able to accept that different opinions, different points of view will come to the same conclusion.
Yeah, they may not. They may come to a different conclusion, but you know, that's fine too, I'd have thought. It's the process that matters, the route by which you get there. And if you're saying that this is one way to do it and nothing else is, then you're closing off those voices to begin with.
Is that not a problem that it's the process that matters and not the result? If you're focusing on the process, the whole time.
I don't think it is, because you end up with products thrown out constantly, series of products, and each one replacing the other one. I think the problem is when you try to reach for a predefined product, get there, and then say, right, that job's done, let's stop. Because the landscape won't stop and the heritage won't stop, it'll carry on going past you.
That sounds like a conversation that could carry on.
Yes, Sam.
I wanted to ask about your interpretation of the changing role of North and Far regulation. Bearing in mind, you talked about it initially for Eastern European states who are going out of communism, beginning to join the EU, about reconciliation to states. Now the Council of Europe wants to start to move towards general reconciliation. Do you think that it will start to move as a guidance document for using things like heritage to help societies integrate as social makeups change?
It was always aimed at the whole of Europe. What I tried to say was that it was initially taken up by those countries because they saw a need for it. Norway signed it too, but Norway signs everything because they're not in the EU. It's their way of being in Europe. And Portugal signed it, of course, because it's signed in Faro. But most of the rest were those two blocks of countries. I've not looked recently. There could be a few other Western ones signing it recently. But I think a lot of the Western countries thought they didn't need to sign it because they were already doing what it said. What didn't apply because we're so advanced in Britain. Our heritage system is so perfect. We don't need the Faro Convention. our civil society is so perfect that we don't need any form of reconciliation whatsoever. I mean, I think you only have to look to Northern Ireland to see that there is a heritage and there's a reconciliation role there for all sorts of things, including heritage. I mean, there must be, but we haven't found it. But I'm not sure if signature matters because the ideas in the convention are out there. And the Council of Europe has moved on to a whole series of projects in those eastern countries mainly, but producing more general documents, not manuals, not like handbooks, if you like, documents about how you can use it for cultural reconciliation. So they're moving on slowly. The problem with the Council of Europe is it's a shrinking organisation, very underfunded now compared to what it was 10, 20 years ago. So there's a limit that they can do. But gradually, the Faro Convention, like the Florence Convention, the last one, gradually it rolls on, more people pick it up, more people deal with it. And it slowly infiltrates into the European Union aspect of things, the European Commission. And I forget the name of that document that came out recently. Remember, Jill? It was a recommendation from the European Parliament and European Commission to a handful of their committees about heritage and the role of heritage in society. And so that month ago, yeah, that sort of thing is beginning to happen as well. I mean, in 5 years' time, what Faro says will be old, and it won't matter whether you've signed it or not, because some of the ideas, not all of them, but some of the ideas we're going into practice, operationalise, as they say.
Well, the implementation of my questions are going to be, if in 5 years' time we consider it
No.
the ideas have been more integrated.
Yeah.
Will you think the EU would produce another set of rules, guidelines, whatever you want to call it, from the convention that's using heritage to help societies integrate, especially as the western part of Europe started to accommodate large portions of the rest of the east?
I think the aim is that some of the ideas and the sentiments of Faro get embedded into some of the EC mainstream programs like the social cohesion policies and social cohesion funds and things. But I suspect it will, because they're all coming from a similar intellectual background to begin with. It just takes time. And economic crisis doesn't help.
Colin.
I just wanted to maybe explore a slightly more ethnographic version of your central question, which is where are you from? That I have two examples. That is actually seen as a fairly racist question, potentially in a lot of the states. If you have ethnicity,
and in this country, it's a difficult question to ask sometimes, yeah.
Exactly, and so and the resistance to that question obviously is the response. It's like, I'm from here. I'm from Houston. I'm from England. And how you other media is the subtext on that one, but. Interestingly, that also comes from a different example. Is there's a very large oral history ethnographic project in Qatar right now that asks Qatari citizens, "Where are you from?" And it is the most deadly question. It is the question that is no silence, because that is actually trying to reveal differences in class and race and social background, class. Which has been leveled by this introduction of a massive immigrant force. And so I also found it really interesting that you kind of flattened the difference between present and past and future, possibly, by saying it's all rivers. So I'm kind of wondering if the real answer to that question is, when you ask where you come from, is that here? Is that now? I am here in this landscape, navigating this landscape from you. Is that actually more important of a question than it is what you're actually trying to get from?
That could, you're probably right, that could well be the question that people decide, the answer that people want to give. The question is still where you're from, but the answer is, it's open to that being the answer. And yes, if I was a second or third generation immigrant living in Bradford, my answer would be here. But it doesn't rule out that question, that answer rather.
How can we empower people to actually say I'm from here?
I think they do, if you ask them.
Okay.
If you don't ask them, then they're not going to say it.
Yeah, fair enough. That's fair.
I think it was Henri Lefebvre who was saying about 1972 that the reason that academics didn't ever get to grips with an understanding of space was that modern academia is so atomized that everybody's looking at it with tunnel vision. So if we accept your point that landscape is everything and everything is landscape, what should academia do about it?
What it already is doing, which is starting to work, and interdisciplinary projects on it. Some of my little Cherryscape projects got archaeologists, geographers, I forget now, other people. I mean, a cost project full of sociologists, social scientists, historians, heritage people, archaeologists. Those sort of things are starting to happen. And the real problem is that something that a Dutch colleague used to say. He was one of the people who was behind the network that wrote the science policy briefing. He always used to say that government has problems, and universities have developments. It doesn't help anybody. So I see landscape as integrating, as being an arena, a place that everyone can come. But of course, it doesn't work. So when the first draft of the science policy briefing, which was entirely about this question that the landscape research sector is wide-ranging, powerful, producing good stuff, but it's fragmented and its impact is lessened, and blah blah blah. When that was sent as a first draft and it was compiled within the ESF cost domains about humanities and social sciences. When the draft was sent to the other domain, including the environmental sciences one, we got a really frosty reception of the environmental scientists saying that you haven't mentioned nature, you haven't mentioned environment. We want it to be like all the documents we've had about the environment. We don't want this. Didn't say it quite that way. That was the implication. So there was a very definite sort of pushing of our tanks off their lawn. They didn't want to engage. They sat on their terms. But I think even that's changing actually, because in the end it was published. So slowly, we've got to meet other people and find out how they think. It's really strange.
Jill, will you?
I have a personal question for you, Graham. You said somewhere at the beginning when you were talking about where are you from, you said somewhere inside that you still think you've got an archaeological view of the world that kind of shapes the way you see things. I'm just wondering, that was really interesting because I think we probably all feel what you mean by that, but how do you think it actually shapes the way that you view the world?
I'm not sure if I can explain it. I think it comes at the barest bones. It comes down to looking at objects, things, places, and asking why.
So it's an intellectual curiosity.
It may be intellectual curiosity, but I always think why? Why is that there? Why is it there, not here? Why does it look like that? That sort of thing. And maybe everyone does that, but I'm not sure if that's true. I don't know.
Do you have a question?
Yeah. I'm from completely different backgrounds. I'm an economist. I'm a health economist actually, and with John, we are kind of trying to make the connection between the social sciences and heritage. My question would be how I do empirical analysis and trying to investigate whether cultural heritage may have an impact and explain variation in industry and unpaid care or informal care supply provision in England. How do you make the transition from talking about landscapes into something that can be actually used by social scientists in their research? Because we need data, we need figures, we need something we can actually use in our research. How do you make this?
I don't think I can answer that. It's a really good question. My instinct would be to go to people and ask them rather than collect numbers. Then I'm not a social scientist, so it's a disciplinary thing. I'd want to somehow try to find out what people liked or didn't like about their surroundings, how it made them feel comfortable or not comfortable, whether it made them feel secure to go and do something unpaid or something which is put them into a position of risk, perhaps, or vulnerability, or something which is stretching themselves. And the opposite, why not? But I have no idea how to do it. You need a nice European interdisciplinary project.
That's what it'll be. Yes, Sam.
Yeah, that's why no one does it. It's hard to say.
It sounds like a wonderful opportunity for
yeah.
setting up, use the government, so you start with Department of Culture, Media, Sport, Business Innovation Skills, so you bring it
health, well-being, yes.
And so it becomes an all-encompassing idea, so that you are heritage, how is going to affect all the environment, the social policy, the business policy, because in the end, heritage and landscape is about what you've got.
Yeah.
So if you do X with that, it can lead to this.
Yeah. They're getting pretty close to a definition of what government exists for, to look after its citizens, which we don't have anymore. Governments do different things these days, but it's pretty close to what governments should be for. I mean, that's where we want, I don't know. Yeah, that's a good point.
Any final questions or comments before we close? Any further questions anyone would like to ask? No? Okay, well, thank you very much, Graham, for coming up from London.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, great pleasure. Very nice to see you. And St Albans, okay, so it's Newcastle, up the A1, as it were. So thank you very much for coming, such an informative and interesting and thought-provoking talk. But just to say, before you all start to disappear, we are going to go to the Lamb and Lion, I think, for a drink. Graham probably hasn't got time to stay for a meal, depending on how quickly they can serve, but we will go over there for a drink. So if anyone wants to join us for a drink, then please do so. There may be a little bit of wine at the back, so if you want to have a last glass of wine before you head off, then do that too. So just to close, thank you, Graham. Thank you again. Thank you.